At the reading of the will, my son and his wife were already opening the champagne. My daughter-in-law whispered to me, "Pack your things. I'm giving you 24 hours to get out." My son didn't even look in my direction, but suddenly the notary stopped them. "Sorry, I didn't read the last line. Your husband didn't leave the house to any of you. He left a video recording. Look at the screen. Now your son will find out that we know everything about him." Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. The day of the will reading should have carried the weight of grief, the heaviness of finality, the quiet reverence owed to a man who'd spent his entire life building a family he believed would remain close even after he was gone. Instead, the moment I stepped into the notary's office, the same bland room where George and I had signed refinancing papers, updated insurance forms, discussed retirement investments, I heard the unmistakable pop of celebration. A cork ricocheted off the ceiling tile. The sound was so violently out of place that for a second I wondered if I'd imagined it, if grief had warped my senses. But then I saw them, Michael holding the bottle aloft, champagne frothing over his knuckles, and Amber clapping her hands like a child at a parade. My heart didn't break in a dramatic, cinematic way. It didn't shatter. No, what I felt was a quiet, cutting fracture, a thin line running straight through me like a crack in glass that had been spreading for years, invisible until the slightest pressure exposed it. I lowered myself into the wooden chair beside the wall, the cushion stiff and unwelcoming, and folded my hands in my lap. They trembled, not from the arthritis I usually blamed, but from a cold shock that crawled up my spine and hollowed out the space beneath my ribs. There are moments in life when time slows, not mercifully, but cruelly, forcing you to see every detail with perfect clarity. I saw the way Michael tilted his head back, drinking straight from the bottle as though marking some glorious achievement. I saw the slight curve of Amber's smile, the kind a predator might wear before lunging for its prey. I saw the notary's startled expression, his eyes flicking from them to me and back again, as though unsure whether he should intervene or simply let the scene unravel. Then Amber walked toward me, her heels clicking with sharp, purposeful taps on the linoleum floor. The scent of her perfume reached me before she did. Overly sweet, synthetic, a poor imitation of jasmine that reminded me of the department store aisles she dragged Michael through during holiday sales. She leaned down so close that her hair brushed my cheek, and her voice slipped into my ear with the oily softness of someone who enjoys causing harm. "Pack your things," she whispered. "I'm giving you 24 hours to get out." I should have responded. I should have stood or glared, or at the very least straightened my back and met her eyes. But shock is a paralyzing thing, more powerful at 72 than it ever was when I was young. It rooted me to the chair, held me still while my mind scrambled for meaning. Get out, as though I were some stray animal she'd allowed into her home out of pity. As though I were not the woman who had scrubbed floors, cooked meals, stretched paychecks, and stayed awake at night calming Michael's childhood terrors with stories and warm compresses. As though the home in question hadn't been mine first, long before he took his first breath. Michael didn't chastise her, didn't tell her to behave, didn't defend me. He didn't even acknowledge I existed. He just poured himself another glass, lifted it as if making a toast, and laughed. A sound that didn't belong to the boy I raised, but to a man shaped by someone else's ambition. People like to pretend motherhood is a bond that time and distance and resentment can never break. Yet as I watched him laugh, I felt distance like a growing chasm between us, one I had sensed forming over years, but had been too hopeful, too forgiving to confront. Raising him alone in the emotional sense, because George, God bless him, was gentle but absent-minded, had been the greatest effort of my life. I carried Michael's fears, triumphs, and tantrums on my shoulders. I gave him all the softness I could while giving myself none. I believed that even if life hardened him, his heart would remain tethered to mine. But in that moment, I saw no tether, no thread of connection, just a man shaped more by greed than gratitude, more by Amber's sharp whispers than by my years of sacrifices. The realization struck hard, a blow straight to the chest that stole my breath for a moment. Shock doesn't feel like a lightning strike. It feels like cold water dumped over your entire being, a freeze that makes it impossible to move or speak or defend yourself. My pulse thudded in my ears, loud and arrhythmic. My vision blurred at the edges, not from tears, but from the sheer effort of holding myself together. They celebrated because they thought they had won, because they believed George's death was the key that unlocked a richer future for them, because in their minds, my husband's passing was not a loss, it was an opportunity. Amber straightened up with a satisfied smirk, as if she had delivered a final blow. Michael continued laughing, basking in the vision of the future he believed was moments away from becoming reality. Shock. The kind that makes you feel both heavy and hollow at the same time. That was all I had left to hold on to as the room spun slowly around me. You might wonder what kind of mother raises a son capable of this. Capable of celebrating his father's death with chilled champagne and a smile sharp enough to cut through whatever pieces of my heart were left. That question has lived with me for years, lodged beneath my ribs like a splinter I could feel, but couldn't pull out, and I've asked myself the same thing 1,000 times, sometimes in anger, sometimes in sorrow, and sometimes in the kind of quiet reflection that only comes to a woman who has already lived most of her life. Because Michael wasn't always like this. He wasn't born cold. He didn't arrive in the world with cunning in his eyes and calculation in his bones. I remember a boy who cried when he found a bird with a broken wing, a boy who hid behind my skirt the first day of kindergarten, gripping the fabric so hard he nearly tore it. I remember small hands clutching mine as though they depended on me for gravity itself, hands that trusted without hesitation. I remember a child who apologized to the refrigerator door when he bumped into it, who believed every creature had feelings right down to the ants he moved gently off the sidewalk so they wouldn't be stepped on. He was soft. He was tender. He was mine. But softness frightens people who thrive on dominance and Amber. Amber was carved from a different world. The first time she came to our home, before she and Michael were even engaged, she spotted immediately what she considered problem areas in him. She didn't say it outright, not at first. She packaged her criticisms in sugary compliments, the kind that sound charming if you're not listening too closely. "He's so gentle," she told me. "Sweet, really, but the world will eat a man alive if he doesn't toughen up." I remember nodding politely, because I was raised to be gracious, but something in me recoiled. The world had already shown Michael enough harshness. Why should he need more? But Amber treated the process of reshaping him like a personal project, the kind a child might approach with a lump of clay, pressing her fingers into him, remolding him, hardening him with every comment, every correction, every strategic withdrawal of affection. She told him he needed a spine, but what she meant was obedience. She told him he had to stand up for himself, but what she wanted was for him to stand against me, to prove his allegiance. Michael mistook all of it for love. I noticed the changes step by step. His voice grew clipped. His patience evaporated. His laughter, once warm and contagious, became something edged, something that landed wrong in the air. He started looking at me the way Amber looked at me, as though I were an obstacle instead of the woman who raised him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my son transformed into someone I no longer recognized. But no matter how his behavior twisted, a part of me clung to the memory of the boy he once was. A mother's heart is the slowest organ to accept reality. It keeps beating hope even when every sign points to loss. And now, here I was at 72, sitting across from the two people who couldn't wait to throw me out of the home I had built with George across nearly 5 decades. 49 years of mismatched furniture, shared laughter, disagreements that ended in reconciliation, and the kind of quiet companionship that becomes a language of its own. This home wasn't just wood and plaster. It was memory layered upon memory, the fingerprints of our lives pressed into every corner. It was the place where Michael took his first steps, where he lost his first tooth, where he sat at the kitchen table sounding out words from his homework while I cooked dinner, where he cried into my shoulder after a middle school bully shoved him into a locker. Now he couldn't shove me out fast enough. Amber sat beside him with the satisfied poise of a victor, legs crossed, fingers drumming lightly on her champagne flute, as though she had already taken mental ownership of everything George and I had built. She didn't look at the walls with nostalgia or at the carpet with recognition. To her, the house was merely an acquisition, a piece of real estate to be flipped, profited from, conquered. And she expected her husband, my son, to carry out that conquest without hesitation. My heart ached, deeply, sharply, in that intimate way that isn't about objects or money or even respect, but about loss. Not the loss of the house. Homes can be rebuilt, relocated, replaced. But the loss of the boy who once held my hand while crossing the street, the boy who looked up to me with trust so pure I sometimes felt unworthy of it. That ache pulsed through me like an old injury flaring up in bad weather, reminding me of everything I had poured into him, every sacrifice made without question. People believe grief only comes from death, but grief can just as easily come from watching someone you love become a stranger. And sitting there in that office, between the clink of champagne glasses and the echo of my own heartbeat, I grieved my son more than I grieved my husband, because George left this world with love still in his eyes. But Michael had left me long before anyone died. And that truth, more than anything, was the wound that throbbed hardest inside me. The notary, Mr. Clarkson, cleared his throat the way a man does when he wishes he could sink through the floor rather than preside over the chaos in front of him. His fingers twitched around his pen. His eyes darted between the champagne bottle and the two people treating this solemn appointment like the opening act of a victory parade. The tension around him hung heavy, awkward, almost embarrassing, like someone laughing loudly at a funeral. And yet Michael and Amber were oblivious, insulated by their own entitlement. "If everyone could please sit," he said softly, with a politeness that only made their behavior feel even more grotesque. Michael clapped his hands together, the sound loud and sharp like the crack of a whip. "Sure, sure," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's get this done. We already know how this ends." His confidence was a knife. Not a metaphorical one. A real one, cold, pointed, and aimed straight at the place where my memories of him still lived. He said the words with the certainty of a man believing the universe revolved around him. He didn't bother to hide his anticipation, didn't soften it out of respect for his father or awareness of his mother's grief. His lack of hesitation was worse than cruelty. It was comfort. comfort in the idea that everything belonged to him simply because he wanted it to. I watched him drop into his chair with an ease that stung. He looked like a man about to receive a promotion he considered long overdue. Amber sat next to him, crossing her legs with the precision of a woman who curated every movement. Her hand brushed his arm, a subtle gesture of possession rather than affection. She folded her hands in her lap and gave Mr. Clarkson a look that said, "Hurry up, old man, we have plans after this." In that moment, I saw so clearly how deeply she had carved herself into Michael's worldview. She had become his compass, his spine, his ambition, and in molding him into the man she wanted, she had reshaped him into someone I no longer recognized. But she wasn't solely to blame. Michael made his choices too. He let himself be reshaped. He chose the comfort of following her voice, rather than the discomfort of confronting his own weakness. Mr. Clarkson unfolded the papers with a care that bordered on reverence, as though he hoped his gentleness might counterbalance their callousness. According to the will, he began carefully, "The lake house goes tow." Michael sliced through the room with his voice. "Yes, yes, to us. Just say it." The certainty in his tone was suffocating. He didn't just expect the inheritance, he believed he deserved it. As if George's years of work, every repaired leak, every tax payment, every late night spent crunching numbers, were nothing more than stepping stones smoothing Michael's path. Amber smirked at me, slow and calculated. The kind of smirk that communicates entire sentences without a single word spoken. "It's ours. You're finished. You are irrelevant." Her eyes radiated victory, cold, gleaming, merciless. She wasn't celebrating the inheritance. She was celebrating my displacement, my erasure. It was stunning in a way. How a person could radiate triumph in the presence of someone who had just buried a husband. George's funeral flowers were still fresh in their vases on my kitchen table. His scent lingered in the closet. His coffee mug sat in the sink where he had left it the morning of his last doctor's appointment. And yet here they were, treating the end of his life like a financial transaction finally clearing. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, nor sadness, nor anger. It was compassion. For myself, and the strangeness of that sensation nearly startled me. Most of my life, I extended compassion outward, to Michael, to George, to friends, to strangers. Women of my generation were raised to do so. We were sculpted to give softness even when we were cracking apart, to soothe others before tending to our own wounds. But sitting in that office, surrounded by the gleam of champagne and the stench of opportunism, I felt an unexpected swell of self-directed tenderness rise inside me. My heart ached for the woman I was in that moment. For the mother who loved a child who no longer saw her as anything but a stepping stone. For the widow still learning how to breathe in a world suddenly emptied of her partner. For the 72-year-old woman who had walked into this office hoping, against logic, against evidence, for a sliver of decency from the son she once rocked to sleep. It wasn't pity. It wasn't weakness. It was recognition. Recognition that I was the only person in that room capable of offering myself the gentleness I deserved, because no one else in that room had any to spare. Mr. Clarkson's hesitation was immediate, palpable, a tangible shift in the air that drew every ounce of tension from the room into a fine electric point. I could feel the small tremor in his hand as he adjusted the papers, a subtle sign that he understood just how combustible this moment could be. I'd spent so long bracing for cruelty, for the betrayal that had been mounting since Amber's first visit to our house, that his pause was almost a relief. A small fissure in the certainty Michael and Amber carried like armor. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice deliberate and slow, almost measured, as though speaking quickly might shatter the fragile veneer of civility he was trying to preserve. "But I haven't read the last line." Amber scoffed immediately, the sound sharp and disdainful. Her laugh was short, clipped, the kind of laugh that carries superiority like a banner. "Whatever," she said, flicking a hand toward him as if swatting away an annoyance. "It won't change anything." Her confidence, previously a blade aimed at me, wavered only slightly, and for a second I felt the faintest flicker of satisfaction. I almost smiled. Almost. But Mr. Clarkson lifted his hand in a gesture that stopped the room like a conductor halting an orchestra mid-piece. The movement was quiet, unassuming, but it carried gravity. "It changes everything," he said. He looked at me first, just me. For a moment, the world seemed to contract. The small notary office transformed into a stage where the outcome of decades of loyalty, love, and quiet endurance balanced on the edge of a single line of text. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw the weight of what was coming. The look wasn't pity, it was recognition, a validation of everything I had endured silently, every compromise I had made, every sacrifice that had been dismissed by the people now sitting across from me. Then he turned to them. "Your husband didn't leave the house to either of you." The words fell like a hammer striking stone. Michael froze mid-sip, the champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips, as though gravity itself had forgotten him. His eyes widened, his brow furrowed, and for the first time that morning, uncertainty replaced arrogance. The unshakable certainty that had been a shield between him and the consequences of his actions cracked, if only by a fraction of an inch. Amber's smile shattered like glass. I could see the cracks spiderwebbing across her carefully curated expression, her composure trembling on the brink of collapse. Her eyes, sharp and calculating a moment ago, widened with something close to fear, or maybe disbelief. Her grip on the champagne flute tightened, knuckles whitening, yet it offered no stability. She had anticipated victory, assumed control, and yet she could not imagine this outcome. I felt my heart thud in my chest, not with the panic that usually accompanies fear, but with a fierce, strange exhilaration. The rhythm of my heartbeat was loud enough that I imagined they could hear it, could feel the proof of a life lived with endurance and dignity beating stubbornly beneath my ribs. I inhaled slowly, savoring the faintest relief, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding all morning. Shock rippled across their faces like waves hitting a cliff. Michael's jaw worked once, twice, as if mechanically trying to form words that wouldn't come. Amber's fingers fumbled with the glass, the champagne sloshing over the rim as her mind raced, searching for a response that might reclaim dominance. But there was none. There was only the weight of reality pressing against their entitlement. I, on the other hand, could finally breathe, just a little, and it was enough to feel alive. The air around me seemed to shift, the suffocating tension easing slightly, making room for something I had almost forgotten in the haze of grief and betrayal. Vindication. Not cruel, not malicious, but the quiet, potent knowledge that what I had hoped for in the private recesses of my mind, a measure of fairness, of George's careful intentions surviving beyond his life, was real. And as I breathed, I felt something else stir, a spark of empowerment. The house, the memories, the sanctuary my husband and I had built were no longer completely out of reach, and for the first time that morning, I was aware of the possibility that I might still matter, that my presence still held weight in a room where my absence had been assumed. Amber's voice, when it came, was brittle. Michael's, hesitant and low, betrayed confusion rather than confrontation. But the notary's gaze remained steady on me, and in that steadiness, I found something more than reassurance. I found the quiet authority of truth asserting itself over entitlement. And for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to feel it fully, shock tempered by relief, fear tempered by clarity, sorrow tempered by justice. I drew in a slow, deliberate breath, letting it fill every corner of me, savoring the rare moment in which the balance had shifted, even if only slightly, toward what was right. Mr. Clarkson's hand trembled slightly as he pressed the button on the remote. The air in the room thickened, as if holding its breath in anticipation. I sat straighter, an instinctive tightening of the spine I didn't realize I still possessed. The office lights glinted off the polished surface of the TV, mounted high on the wall like a watchful sentinel. Amber rolled her eyes, the motion sharp and impatient, and I felt a spark of amusement flicker inside me despite the tension. "Oh, for God's sake, what is this, a farewell speech?" she muttered, her tone a mixture of scorn and irritation. The words were almost comedic in their arrogance, but I forced myself to resist smiling too widely. This was no comedy. It was vindication in its purest form, wrapped in the image of the man who had guided my life for nearly 50 years. Michael muttered, almost as if talking to himself. Dad loved his theatrics. He chuckled nervously, a sound that did not carry the confidence it had moments ago. There was an edge of unease, a tremor beneath his veneer of control. He thought he knew the narrative, the story of the inheritance, the predictable arc he could manipulate at will. He did not know that the climax of this story had already been set before he could even open his mouth. And then George appeared. The first sight of him startled me, not because of grief, not because of absence, but because of presence. He was strong, undeniably so. His posture was straight, deliberate. His eyes were sharp, clear, and unwavering, as if he had reached across time and space to assert his authority over this room, this moment. He was not the frail, aging figure Michael had always implied he would be. He was composed, commanding, fully aware of the people sitting before him, and more importantly, of the deceit and entitlement that had taken root in the son I had once nurtured with hope and love. I felt a thrill run through me, a quiet but potent mixture of fear and exhilaration. George had never been theatrical for its own sake. Every nuance, every word he chose, carried weight, meaning, and consequence. And now, through the flickering pixels of a screen, he had returned, not physically, but morally, spiritually, strategically, to reclaim the authority of the life he had built. Michael, his voice resonated through the office, rich and deliberate, like the toll of a church bell cutting through a quiet morning. It was a voice that demanded attention, that refused to be ignored. Every head turned instinctively, every instinct of obedience and recognition awakening in the room. "I know everything." The words struck like lightning, a sudden clarity that split the air into fragments of disbelief, recognition, and dread. I could feel it, anger. Not the small, fleeting irritations that accompany daily frustrations. Not the simmering irritations of a mother watching entitlement flourish in a child. No, this was hot, sharp, pure anger. The kind that had burned silently for years, smoldering in every unspoken confrontation, every dismissed feeling, every quiet observation of injustice that Michael and Amber had perpetrated with casual cruelty. It rose now, fully formed, a wildfire ignited by truth itself. Amber swallowed hard, the sound audible, a fragile human reaction betraying the invincibility she had tried to project. Her confidence wavered, her smirk cracking into something smaller, less certain. For the first time, she felt the weight of scrutiny she had always avoided, the piercing awareness that her manipulations were no longer hidden. Michael paled, the flush of self-assurance drained from his face, leaving an ashen mask. His posture shifted, slight but unmistakable, the first tremor of uncertainty that hinted at guilt, at realization. His hands, which had moments ago gripped the champagne glass with the arrogance of entitlement, now fumbled at the rim, betraying him. He was caught, and for the first time, he could not deflect. He could not hide. He could not laugh his way past the truth of his father's observation. I felt a rush of emotion, something I had long suppressed, fearing its intensity, fearing it might betray me. Relief intertwined with the anger, a combustible mixture of vindication and grief and love and frustration. I realized that the power in the room had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer about what Michael and Amber could claim or control. It was about what George, through his foresight and meticulous planning, had orchestrated, and what I, finally, could witness without fear. The video continued, but I barely heard it. I didn't need every word, every detail. The weight of his presence, the force of his acknowledgement, was enough to unbalance the arrogance that had been perched so comfortably on Michael's shoulders for decades. And I breathed. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the stirrings of freedom, enough to feel that justice, subtle and deliberate, had finally begun to tilt in my favor. The anger that had simmered quietly in my chest for years was no longer alone. It had allies in truth, foresight, and the sharp clarity of a man who, though gone, had never underestimated the depth of human folly. And in that moment, I realized something I had not allowed myself to feel until now. Empowerment does not always arrive in force. Sometimes it arrives in the cadence of a voice, the flicker of a screen, the acknowledgement that even the strongest arrogance can be seen, known, and held accountable. I let my gaze drift between them. Amber, fuming but powerless. Michael, frozen but conscious of the collapse of his control. And I understood fully that the balance had shifted. For the first time, I felt that what was coming next would not be dictated by fear, by resignation, or by the expectation of entitlement. It would be dictated by truth. The room held its breath. I could feel it in my bones, the tension so thick it seemed to press against my chest. George's image on the screen was unwavering, immovable, commanding. He was there, and he was present in a way that left no room for evasion, no loopholes, no defenses. Every word he spoke cut through the pretense that had been layered over the last years of my life. I know you planned to sell the house while I was still alive. I know you pressured your mother for access to our accounts. I know you and Amber hoped my condition would speed up. Yes, I heard that too. The words fell like stones. Each one hit Michael directly, but I felt them in my chest as if he were confessing not only to me, but to the air itself, to the house George and I had built together, to the memories embedded in its walls. I tried to swallow, tried to keep steady, but my throat felt raw, tight, and full. Michael's face went pale in a way that made him look almost translucent. I wanted to reach across the table, touch him, but a part of me froze, unsure if he deserved consolation. This was the son I had raised, the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and tear-stained cheeks, and yet now he looked like a child caught doing something unforgivable. He wanted to melt, to vanish, to become invisible beneath the weight of his own shame, and I could see the instinctive panic flashing behind his eyes. Amber's reaction was immediate, desperate, unconvincing. This is fake. Deep fake. It has to be. Her voice was high-pitched, edged with hysteria. Her perfectly applied makeup betrayed a hint of sweat near her temples, and the sharp fragrance of her perfume felt almost like armor against the reality she couldn't deny. She wanted to believe it wasn't real because the reality was unbearable. She had built her life on control, on manipulation, and now all of it was unraveling before her eyes. But George's presence did not falter. The image on the screen held a gravity that made denial impossible, a weight that could not be shaken by fear or shouted accusations. I also know, he continued, his voice steady, measured, but piercing, that you tried to convince your mother to sign over the deed the week I was hospitalized. You told her it was for tax reasons. My breath caught. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, a combination of shock and vindication. He had known. He had known everything. Not only had he seen through their scheming, but he had also anticipated it, documented it, and now, in a final act of justice, revealed it with precision and timing that left no room for rebuttal. I looked at Michael. He opened his mouth, a desperate attempt at words, but the first sound that emerged was brittle, fractured. "Dad, that's not." George's voice cut through him like steel, slicing the air, the tension, the fragile defenses Michael had constructed over decades. "Don't lie. Not now." The command was absolute, leaving no space for excuses, no room for evasion. The finality in that tone was undeniable. Truth, judgment, and moral reckoning had arrived simultaneously. Amber flinched, almost imperceptibly, and I realized how entirely strict she was in that moment. All the bravado, the smiles, the whispers behind my back, the quiet manipulations, they counted for nothing. Michael tried to turn toward me, as if seeking solidarity, but I remained still. My gaze locked on him, steady, unwavering, as if to communicate that what was happening now was not just between George and them. It was a reckoning they had long evaded, a mirror held up to every calculated lie, every betrayal, every act of cold ambition. I felt a strange mix of emotions I hadn't anticipated. Relief, because the facade was finally cracking. Fear, because confrontation, even virtual confrontation, carried weight and could stir long-buried pain. Anger, so hot it made my hands clench involuntarily, and a quiet, fierce pride that George had orchestrated this with such meticulous care. I was proud of him, even in this posthumous act of justice, and proud of myself for enduring the quiet manipulations without surrendering to despair. Michael's lips trembled. His voice came out in a strangled whisper, faltering under the weight of realization. Amber's denial faltered, her breathing uneven, her confidence unraveling in real time. And I, despite the tears that threatened to fall, despite the tight knot in my chest, felt alive in a way I had not felt in years. I realized with a clarity that surprised me that this was not simply a moment of vengeance. It was a moment of revelation, of illumination, of exposure. Truth, carefully prepared, was now impossible to ignore. The power of knowledge, wielded with precision, had stripped away the arrogance and entitlement that had dominated the room for decades. I could feel George's presence even without seeing him in flesh, guiding the truth with the steady hand he had always used to shape our lives. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I understood something profound. Control, deception, and greed may rise quickly, but foresight, integrity, and love, subtle, patient, enduring, always endure beyond the moment. I remained seated, Watching Michael shrink under the weight of revelation, Amber falter in disbelief, and the room vibrate with a tension that had no release. The video continued, but I no longer needed to hear the words. Every syllable, every pause, every measured look from George's face said enough. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated me. And I, finally, felt the shift of power in the room, the subtle, undeniable tilting of justice, orchestrated with precision, patience, and love. It was a quiet victory, but one that carried the weight of decades. The room was still. The air hummed with the gravity of unspoken truths. I breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the moment settle, absorbing the full force of what had just occurred. Michael and Amber were trapped in their own unraveling, and I, finally, irrevocably, was free to witness it, fully present, fully aware, and fully alive. George leaned closer to the camera, his face filling the screen with an intensity that made the room shrink around me. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and his voice carried a calm finality that brooked no argument, no denial, no excuses. So here is my last wish, my final decision. The house does not go to you. Not a single cent does. Everything is left to your mother. Amber gasped as if someone had struck her across the face. The sound was sharp, involuntary, a human reaction to a truth too heavy to absorb gracefully. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her nails digging into her skin as if to hold herself together, but it was too late. Her entire, carefully constructed world was crumbling in an instant. Michael's hand trembled. I watched with a strange, almost clinical clarity as his glass of champagne slipped from his grasp. Time seemed to slow. The crystal hit the polished floor and exploded into shards. Each fragment caught the light, tiny points of reflection like the fractured pieces of trust, respect, and affection that had once existed in that house. He froze, his face pale, and I saw the first hints of real fear, not just for the loss of inheritance, but for the exposure of his own moral bankruptcy. And George added, his voice unwavering, I leave this video so you both understand why. The screen went black. The image of my husband, the presence of the man who had been the center of our lives for decades, vanished into shadows, but the weight of his message lingered like smoke in the room. Silence fell immediately. Thick, humiliating, claustrophobic. For them. For me, it was something else entirely. Relief. Sharp, glorious, cathartic relief. I could feel it in my chest, a release I had not anticipated, but had yearned for over decades of quiet, invisible battles. It was not vindictive. It was not rage. It was justice, patient, deliberate, delivered with the precision of a man who had always understood the world better than anyone else in it. George had spoken from beyond the confines of mortality, and in that final act, the scales had been balanced. I stood, slowly, deliberately. My bones creaked like an old floorboard in an empty house, but I did not falter. Each step toward the door was steady, measured, a deliberate march away from the betrayal and arrogance that had filled the room for far too long. I could feel Michael's eyes on me, finally, truly on me. For the first time that day, for the first time in years, he acknowledged my presence as more than an obstacle, a nuisance, or a symbol of inconvenience. But I said nothing of the tenderness, the sorrow, the nostalgia that fluttered briefly in my chest. I did not soften. I did not smile. I did not forgive. My words were as deliberate and cutting as George's last will, as final as his recorded voice. 24 hours. No, dear, you have 24 hours. Michael's jaw tightened. His lips parted, as if to argue, to plead, but no sound emerged that could undo the weight of the truth already cemented in that room. Amber's face paled further, her mascara streaked by tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed before. I did not pity them. I did not feel the compulsion to justify my actions or soften the blow. This was their reckoning, and it was long overdue. I walked toward the door with my head held high. Each step carried the echo of the life George and I had built together, the years of love, of struggle, of laughter and tears that had shaped me, strengthened me, and prepared me for this moment. The hall smelled faintly of polished wood and old leather, a scent that brought back memories of quieter days, of Christmas mornings, of the times when Michael was still a boy who looked to me for guidance, not entitlement. As I passed the shattered glass, I did not flinch. Each fragment seemed to glint with irony, reflecting back the hubris and greed of two people who had thought themselves cleverer than life itself. I felt a pulse of something unexpected, schadenfreude, sweet, righteous, undeniable. A long-buried sense of satisfaction that comes only when the truth lands exactly where it belongs. No one followed me. The room remained frozen in the aftermath of exposure. I did not turn back. I did not look for validation. I did not need it. My relief was complete, a quiet, profound liberation that had nothing to do with wealth or material possessions. George had left me the ultimate inheritance, justice delivered in the purest, most uncompromising form. Outside, the air was crisp. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawn, painting the familiar house in gold and amber. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders. For decades, I had endured betrayal, manipulation, and quiet cruelty. Now, as I stepped away from the notary's office, I felt a freedom that was almost intoxicating. I was no longer just George's widow. I was the woman who had survived, who had watched, who had endured, and who had finally, utterly prevailed. And as I closed the car door behind me and started the engine, I knew that nothing could touch me. Not Michael, not Amber, not their greed, not their cruelty. George had spoken, truth had triumphed, and I had walked out with my dignity intact, my heart unburdened, my spirit unbroken. The house, the inheritance, the years of secrecy and deception, they belonged to me now. Not just because George had willed them so, but because I had survived, and I had witnessed the ultimate reckoning. Relief, yes, but also a fierce, burning affirmation of life, resilience, and the unassailable power of truth. I drove away slowly, savoring every turn, every passing streetlight, every breath of wind through the open window. Justice had been done, and for the first time in far too many years, I felt profoundly, gloriously, and utterly free.